Tired of big tech clashing with your Catholic values? Fide Chat is now live on the Apple App Store and Google Play Store. It's private, encrypted, and built by Catholics for Catholics, with features like parental controls and more. Connect securely with family, friends, and groups. Download Fide Chat at fide.email. Technology without compromise.
The subject of the resignation of Benedict XVI is one that you'd think that with having a new pope, it would be gone. It'd be done. People would have moved on, but not exactly. Vigano even kind of cracks a joke about this himself in this public statement he issued within the last couple of days. And now, curiously, this has not been picked up by the English press at all. So we had to translate this. It was published by Marco Tossati on his website, and I can already hear an echo in the room I'm in. I'm on the road with family right now, broadcasting to you from a hotel room while my family sleeps. So I can't do anything about the echo quality. So I just hope that you will bear with me. We'll keep these streams on these days a little more concise than in other days. Go to Marco Tossati's website. Mr. Tossati is an Italian journalist with very deep connections to the Vatican. He knows a lot of people, we'll say. He published this letter by Vigano under the title Benedict XVI's Letter to Monsignor Bux, Archbishop Vigano's commentary on the disintegrating papacy. Now, for some context, Monsignor Bux, who used to work in the Roman Curia under Pope Benedict XVI, had issued a article, I guess you could call it, talking about how he had a letter exchange with Benedict XVI at one point, talking about the resignation. And according to Monsignor Bux, Benedict XVI was utterly flabbergasted that people thought that his resignation was invalid. Monsignor Bux repeats what we have heard many times from those who don't question at all the resignation, that everything was on the up, and Benedict intended to fully resign the papacy, and that he endorsed Pope Francis and all the rest of the positions. And the story, though, won't die. And this is partially because there are questions in the resignation letter, but also it's just very curious how a lot of things happen. We know there were a lot of extenuating circumstances and odd coincidences in the resignation, and all that adds fuel to the fire of the questioning about it. So here's Vigano chiming in on this. The discomposed papacy. The never-ending saga surrounding Benedict XVI's resignation continues to fuel an increasingly bold and surreal narrative of the events we have witnessed over the past decade. Inconsistent and unsupported theories have taken hold among countless faithful and even priests, increasing confusion and disorientation. But if this has been possible, it is largely due to those who, knowing the truth, nonetheless fear the consequences it could have once revealed. Indeed, there are those who believe it is preferable to maintain a web of lies and deception rather than a question of past of connivance, silence, and complicity. During the meeting at the Renaissance Mediterraneo Hotel in Naples with Catholics from the local Coitus Fidelium, held on November 22nd, Monsignor Nicola Bux mentioned an exchange of letters with, quote, Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI. As an aside, Vigano is one who does find the resignation suspicious, especially since there has never been a Pope Emeritus in the history of the Church. That title never existed until Benedict. Dating back to the summer of 2014, which would debunk theories regarding the invalidity of the resignation. The contents of these letters, the first from Monsignor Bux, dated July 19th, 2014, 3 pages, and the second from Benedict XVI, dated August 21st, 2014, 2 pages, were not released 10 years ago, as would have been more than desirable, but their existence was only hinted at today. I happen to be aware of both this exchange of letters and its content. Why did Archbishop Bux decide not to promptly disclose Benedict XVI's response while he was still alive and able to confirm and substantiate it, and instead simply reveal its existence without disclosing its content nearly 2 years after his death? Why hide this authoritative and crucial statement from the Church and the world? To answer these legitimate questions, we must set aside the media fiction. First, we must understand that the opposing vision of a saint now Ratzinger and a bad and evil Bergoglio is convenient for many. This simplistic, contrived, and false approach avoids addressing the heart of the problem. The perfect coherence of action of the conciliar popes from John the 23rd and Paul the 6th to the self-styled Francis, including John Paul II and Benedict the 16th. The goals are the same, even if pursued with different methods and language. The image of an elderly, elegant, and refined theologian wearing a Roman chasuble and red sandals, who recognizes the Tridentine rite as a Christian and of an intemperate worldwide heresiarch who refuses to celebrate Mass and undermines Summorum Pontificum while promulgating the Mayan liturgy with females practicing Thurics, is part of the forced polarization operation. We have also seen adopted in the civil sphere, where a similar subversive project has been carried out by favoring ultra-progressive forces on the one hand and by pacifying dissenting voices on the other. In reality, Ratzinger and Bergoglio, and this is precisely what conservatives refuse to acknowledge, constitute two moments in a revolutionary process that encompasses alternating and only apparently opposing phases, following the Hegelian dialectic of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. A process that does not begin with Ratzinger and will not end with Bergoglio, but which dates back to Roncalli and seems destined to continue as long as the embedded church continues to replace the Catholic hierarchy, usurping its authority. In Ratzinger's vision, the thesis of the Vetus Ordo meaning the traditional Latin Mass, and the antithesis of the Novus Ordo are combined in the synthesis of Summorum Pontificum, thanks to the subterfuge of a single rite in two forms. But this peaceful coexistence is the product of German idealism, and it is false because it is based on the denial of the incompatibility between two ways of conceiving the Church, one sanctioned by 2,000 years of Catholicism, the other imposed by the Second Vatican Council, thanks to the work of heretics, until then condemned by the Roman pontiffs. We find the same modus operandi in the will expressed first by Paul VI, then by John Paul II, and finally by Benedict XVI to redefine the papacy in a collegial and ecumenical key, ad mentem concili, where the divine institution of the Church and the papacy, thesis, and the heretical demands of the neo-modernist and non-Catholic groups, antithesis, are composed in the synthesis of a redefinition of the papacy in an ecumenical key. Proposed by the encyclical Ut Unum Sint, promulgated by John Paul II in 1995, and more recently formulated in the study document of the Dicastery for Promoting Christian Unity of last June 13th, the Bishop of Rome, Primacy and Synodality in Ecumenical Dialogues, and the responses to the encyclical Ut Unum Sint. He's talking here about a document issued by Rome last summer that, if implemented, would completely annihilate the papacy and turn the Pope into a first among equals, symbolic head of the Church, no real authority, the ultimate synodal vision for the Roman pontiff. And the backlash to that document was so extraordinary that the author, Cardinal Koch, had to back off a little bit and say, oh, this is just a proposal. It's nothing concrete. We shall see. It will not be surprising to learn, as Cardinal Walter Brandmuller confided to me in January 2020 in response to a specific question of mine, that Professor Joseph Ratzinger developed the theory of the emeritus and collegial papacy with his colleague Karl Rahner in the 1970s, when both were young theologians. During a telephone conversation I had in 2020, a trusted assistant of Benedict XVI confirmed to me the Pope's intention, reiterated to her several times to retire to private life in his Bavarian residence without retaining either the apostolic name or the papal vestments. But this eventuality was considered inappropriate for those who would lose power in the Vatican, especially those conservatives who looked to Benedict XVI as their model and had mythologized him. We don't know for certain whether the solution the young Ratzinger theorized with Rahner was still being contemplated by the elderly pontiff, nor whether the papacy emeritus was resurrected by those who wanted to keep Benedict in the Vatican, including by taking advantage of external pressure on the Holy See, which materialized with the Vatican's suspension from the SWIFT system, that's an international banking financial mechanism, significantly reinstated immediately after the announcement of his resignation. In fact, his resignation created immense confusion within the ecclesial body and handed the Holy See of Peter over to its destroyer, a situation which in any case involves Joseph Ratzinger. Benedict then resorted to the invention of the papacy emeritus, seeking in violation of canonical practice to maintain the image of the fine theologian and defensor traditionis that his entourage had constructed. Moreover, an analysis of the events surrounding the epilogue of his pontificate is extremely complex, both because of Ratzinger's intellectual and character traits, the opaque actions of his collaborators in the Curia, and finally, the absolute Greek word of the resignation as affected by Benedict XVI, a completely unprecedented modality never before seen in the history of the papacy. On the one hand, the parentheses of Mosetas and Camari was to be eclipsed with a handover to the already designated Archbishop of Buenos Aires, nominated by the St. Gallen Group to take his place since the 2005 conclave. That has been confirmed, by the way, that Bergoglio, as Cardinal Archbishop of Buenos Aires, had been handpicked by the St. Gallen Group back in 2005 when their leader at the time became too ill to pursue the papacy himself anymore. That'd be Cardinal Martini. And in 2005, Bergoglio nearly became Pope Francis, came very close, and would, of course, become him in 2013. The role of Benedict XVI as emeritus had the function of supporting a sort of conservative papacy, Munus, that would keep watch over Bergoglio's progressive papacy, ministerium, so as to hold together the moderately conservative Ratzingerian component and the violently progressive Bergoglian one, favoring the perception of a continuity between the Pope Emeritus and the reigning Pope. Essentially, a way was found to keep Benedict in the Vatican, so that his presence within the Leonine walls would appear as a form of approval of Bergoglio and the aberrations of his pontificate. For his part, the Argentine saw in this canonical monstrum, for such as the papacy emeritus, an instrument for the deconstruction of the papacy along conciliar, synodal, and ecumenical lines, something, as we know, was shared by Benedict XVI himself. It must be said that the institution of the episcopate emeritus is also a canonical monstrum, because with it the diocesan bishop's jurisdiction is frozen based on his age, upon reaching the age of 75, contrary to the centuries-old practice of the Church. The episcopate emeritus, by diminishing the bishop's awareness of being successors of the apostles, has also had the immediate consequence of a total deprivation of responsibility, relegating them to the role of mere functionaries and bureaucrats. The institutionalization of episcopal conferences as governing bodies that interfere with and hinder the exercise of the potestas of individual bishops has certainly constituted an attack on the divine constitution of the Catholic Church and its apostolicity. The episcopate emeritus, meaning he's the bishop emeritus, the concept of a retired bishop in the church. And he is right, it is a novelty that never existed until fairly recently. Introduced immediately after the council in 1966 with the motu proprio Ecclesia Sancta, and later incorporated into the 1983 Code of Canon Law, reveals the significant coherence of the 1970 Introgestum Aetatum, which deprives cardinals aged 75 of their curia functions, and those 80 of the right to elect the Pope in conclave. Beyond the juridical formulation of these ecclesiastical laws, their meaning can only be understood from the perspective of the deliberate exclusion of elderly bishops and cardinals from the life of the Church, aimed at encouraging a generational turnover, a true reset of the Catholic hierarchy, which prelates ideologically closer to the new demands promoted by the Vatican. By Vatican II. This artificial purge of the oldest members of the episcopate and the College of Cardinals, and therefore presumably least inclined to innovation, ended up distorting the internal balance of power within the hierarchy, in accordance with the worldly and secular approach already widely adopted in the civil sphere. And when, under the pontificate of John Paul II, the so-called Montini widows, that is, the cardinals who had reached the age limit in the 1980s, requested the revocation of the document forcing them to retire so as not to be excluded from the conclave, it became clear that even the progressives of the 1970s were now destined to fall victim to the very norm they had invoked for others. It will not go unnoticed that in the perspective of redefinition of the papacy in a synodal key, where the Bishop of Rome is considered primus inter pares, the institution of the episcopate emeritus and the norms that limit the exercise of the episcopate and the cardinalate upon reaching a certain age constitute the premise of the institutionalization of the papacy emeritus and the jubilation of the elderly pope. From the thesis of the papacy, I am pope, in conflict with the antithesis of renunciation, I am no longer pope, results a concept in constant evolution, just as becoming is the absolute for Hegel, that is, the synthesis of the papacy emeritus. I'm still pope, but I am no longer pope. This philosophical aspect of Joseph Ratzinger's thought, which is specific and recurring, should not be overlooked. The synthesis is in itself provisional, with a view to its mutation into a thesis that will be counterposed by a new antithesis that will give rise to a further synthesis, itself provisional. This incessant evolution, meaning never ending, the breakdown of the concept and the evolution into a new concept cycle that he's describing here never ends. It is revolution without end. It is the ideological, philosophical, and doctrinal basis of the permanent revolution inaugurated by the Second Vatican Council on the ecclesial front and by the global left on the political front. We thus witness a sort of artificial separation of the papacy. On the one hand, the Pope renounced the papacy, and on the other, the person Pape, Joseph Ratzinger, sought to maintain certain aspects of it that would guarantee him protection and prestige. Since his physical departure from the Apostolic See could be seen as a form of disapproval of the Church's governance lines imposed by the Bergoglians, both the personal secretary and secretary of state pressed hard for Ratzinger to remain half-service, so to speak, playing on the fictitious separation between Munus and ministerium, a separation, moreover, vigorously denied in the emeritus' responses to Monsignor Bucks, meaning Benedict XVI denied wholeheartedly that he had tried to renounce the Munus but keep the ministerium, or vice versa. He did not try to separate the two, according to himself and everybody around him. Now, people who read his resignation letter will tend to often disagree with that. Professor Enrico Maria Radali has highlighted in his in-depth studies that this arbitrary division of the Petrine mandate into Munus and ministerium invalidates the resignation. Since the Petrine primacy cannot be broken down into Munus and ministerium, being a potestas that Christ the King and Pontiff confers upon the one elected to be Bishop of Rome and successor of Peter, Ratzinger's denial in the aforementioned letter that he did not wish to separate Munus and ministerium contradicts Benedict's own admission that he modeled the papacy emeritus on the episcopate emeritus, which is precisely based on this artificial and impossible separation between being and acting as pope and between being and acting as bishop. And this is the bombshell. I've not really seen anybody point this out. We'll come back to this in a second. That in all the years of looking at this question of the resignation of the pontiff, nobody has ever connected this really to the concept, as far as I am aware, no one's really connected this to the retirement of bishops, because everybody just kind of accepts the retirement of bishops. But bishops didn't retire until the 1960s. It was never done. They served until they couldn't. And now you have this thing where a bishop is no longer a bishop, but is still a bishop, a contradiction in terms, the separation of the munus from the ministerium. And you have Ratzinger himself saying he was trying to do the same thing with his resignation, while simultaneously saying he was not trying to do the same thing with his resignation. It gets very curious here. Vigano continues saying, the absurdity of this division is evident. If it were possible to possess the munus without exercising the ministerium, it should equally be possible to exercise the ministerium without possessing the munus. That is, to carry out the functions of pope without being one, which is such an aberration that it radically undermines the consensus for assuming the papacy itself. And in a certain sense, we saw this surreal dichotomy between munus and ministerium realized when the emeritus was pope but did not exercise the papacy, while Bergoglio was pope without being one. Again, Vigano is a believer that Francis was illegitimate and that Benedict's resignation was invalid. Moreover, the process of desacralization of the papacy begun by Paul VI, consider the dramatic deposition of the papal tiara, where he was the first pope to dramatically remove the papal tiara and stop wearing it, and none of his successors since have ever done it, continued uninterrupted even under the pontificate of Benedict XVI, who also removed the tiara from the papal coat of arms. This is primarily attributed to the new heretical ecclesiology of Vatican II, which embraced the demands of a secularized and democratic society by welcoming concepts such as collegiality and synodality into the church that are ontologically alien to it, thus distorting the monarchical nature of the church intended by its divine founder. It is certainly astonishing and immensely saddening to see the zeal with which the conciliar and synodal hierarchy has promoted subversion within the Catholic Church. A sequence of reforms, norms, and pastoral practices for over 60 years have systematically demolished what until before Vatican II was considered inviolable and unreformable. It should also be remembered that Benedict XVI's resignation was not followed by a normal conclave, in which the electors calmly chose the candidate to succeed to the See of Peter, but by a veritable takeover carried out ex professo by the St. Gallen group, that is, the subversive element that had infiltrated the church over the preceding decades through tampering with and violating the regular process and resorting to basically trying to control people and put pressure on the College of Cardinals. Let us not forget that an eminent prelate confided to acquaintances that what he had personally witnessed in conclave could jeopardize the validity of Jorge Mario Bergoglio's election. In this case, too, incomprehensibly, the good of the church and the salvation of souls were set aside in the name of a self-righteous observance of the pontifical secret, perhaps not free from blackmail and threats. And we're going to pause here again. There were reports that some cardinals who remained anonymous when they said it told some fairly trusted journalists that the things they saw in the conclave might have invalidated the conclave. Now, to give them a little bit of backup on this, Cardinal Godfrey de Niels, who appeared on the Loggia with Pope Francis in 2013, bragged that he had engaged in politicking to get Francis elected. Politicking is explicitly rejected. It is banned by the laws of the church. And the consequence is, if you politic at a conclave, you invalidate the outcome. You have to have a new conclave. And yet Godfrey de Niels bragged about doing so. There is a clear contradiction between the goal Benedict set for himself, renouncing the papacy, and the means he chose to achieve it, based on the invention of the papacy emeritus. This contradiction, in which Benedict subjectively resigned but objectively created a canonical monstrum, constitutes such a subversive act that it renders the resignation null and void. In due course, this contradiction will have to be remedied by an authoritative pronouncement, but the inescapable fact remains that the form in which the resignation was presented does not eliminate the subsequent irregularities that led Bergoglio to usurp the See of Peter with the complicity of the established church and state, nor is it possible to think that the resignation should not be read in light of the subversive plan aimed at ousting Benedict XVI and replacing him with an emissary of the ruling elite. The castle of lies in which lay people, priests, and prelates cooperate, even in good faith, remains a cage in which they have imprisoned themselves. In the media dramatization, the actors Ratzinger and Bergoglio have been presented to us as bearers of opposing theologies, when in reality they represent two successive stages of the same revolutionary process. And as an aside, that's a very unpopular position to take, because Benedict XVI was probably the best pope in terms of theology since the council. But the problem is, he was still a revolutionary actor himself, and it's an unpopular position to take to point that out to people. But appearance, the simulacrum on which mass communication is based, cannot replace the substance of truth, to which the Catholic Church is indefectibly bound by divine mandate. To the many scandalized faithful, to the many confused and indignant priests and religious, to the few, at least for now, who are raising their voices to denounce the takeover perpetrated against the Holy Church by her own ministers, I extend my encouragement to persevere in fidelity to our Lord, high and eternal priest, head of the mystical body. Resist strong in faith. The Prince of the Apostles admonishes us, see 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 9, knowing that your brothers scattered throughout the world are undergoing the same sufferings as you. The slumber in which the Savior seems to ignore us while the bark of Peter is tossed by the storm must be for us an incentive to invoke his help, because only when we turn to him, leaving aside human respect, inconsistent theories, and political calculations, will we see him awaken and command the winds and the sea to calm. Resisting in faith calls for the struggle to remain faithful to what the Lord has taught and commanded, precisely at a time when many, especially those at the top of the hierarchy, abandon him, deny him, and betray him. Resisting in faith implies not fainting in times of trial, knowing how to draw from him the strength to overcome it victoriously. Resisting in faith ultimately means knowing how to face the reality of the passio ecclesia, that would be the passion of the church, and the mysterium iniquitus, the mystery of iniquity, without trying to conceal the deception behind which Christ's enemies hide. This is the meaning of the Savior's words. You'll know the truth, and the truth will set you free. This is an interesting letter, republished recently at Vigano's request. And he did it because Monsignor Bucks's letters are suddenly making the rounds right now. I'm curious what you think about that. Is that a unpopular position to take? Do you find it hard to believe? And I know a lot of people don't like Vigano because he went too deep onto secular politics and saying some pretty fringe-sounding things to a lot of people. But I don't think it's wrong to point out that until the 1960s, you didn't have bishops retire, and then cardinals forced to retire. And then that Benedict was invoking that example with the papacy emeritus. The entire question rests on, is that valid or not? If we expect bishops and priests and cardinals to be willing to walk the path of martyrs if need be for the church, then perhaps it's not valid, their retirement, except for in situations where they can no longer physically serve. I'm curious what you think of this. Let me know in the comments, please. I'll have the link to that letter posted pretty soon on returntotradition.org and to the Anthony Stine Substack. Links in the description box below. Let me know what you think of all this in the comments, please. Hit like and subscribe if you haven't. It does help. Sharing this on social media helps too. And as always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.